Hi everybody, this is Mark and welcome back to Beyond Profit, a Global Perspective. I am going to start a series of videos on international political economy, more specifically theories of global trade. If you want to understand how international business operates on a global scale, and then you need to know something about how trade works. Now, there are a number of different perspectives on how we should interpret trade, and the question of how much of it is driven by business, how much of it is driven by politics, security, and power. These are big questions. And so we are going to start this episode by talking about a theory of international political economy called liberalism. So let's get started. Before we get started, I wanted to invite you to like this channel, like this video, subscribe, continue to support what I do. And hey, if you want to come and learn more, come join me at the University of St. Mary. I run the MBA program here. I would love to see you join us and be part of that. This is where we left off last week. We were talking about globalization, right? We talked about it being a process of social, political, economic, cultural, and technological integration among countries around the world. I've shown you charts that show how it has accelerated exponentially, and we documented how a really big part of the U.S. economy is really involved in this globalization thing. We even talked about it a little bit. I asked all of you, like, hey, are you a fan? What do you think of globalization? And you're like, hey, that's pretty good. I like that idea. But I want to talk about it in a more theoretical sense. That is, like, we know that it's happened, but I want to try to understand why it's happened, why it is a good idea, right? It's in the abstract, it's easy to sort of say, oh yeah, it's nice that countries trade and all this stuff, right? But like, what's the rationale behind it? So that as you become maybe a global business leader, your future business leader, it's important to understand this, because understanding this is an important aspect of understanding the international business environment. What I'm going to do is talk about the first major theory of international trade that I will introduce you in this class, and I'm going to loosely refer to that as liberalism, or at least some would say economic liberalism. And notice I have the word liberal here with a giant L here, because a lot of people are kind of scared of this word. It's like, ooh, liberal. We are not actually talking about the kind of liberal that we might be talking about in American politics, right? So American politics, usually you have the Democratic Party, which is considered to be the more liberal of the parties, you know, Republican being more conservative and so on. There's lots of ways that we can use the word liberal to describe things. But when we're talking about things being economically liberal, we are talking about maximum economic freedom, right? Lots of choices. We are talking about really ultimately free trade. We're going to take any restrictions on economic activity and try to eliminate that. And that's really the bottom line here as far as what liberalism is all about, what we're talking about this theory, okay? So at least traditionally, I know things have sort of changed in terms of people's economic attitudes, in terms of the ideology of the major parties, but it used to be that both Republicans and Democrats in this country were largely inclined toward this sort of relatively more open economic approach, particularly internationally, being supportive of things like free trade, right? That has changed substantially since, you know, the Donald Trump revolution has come around, where we now have a political party that's governed by this idea that we ought to have more restrictions on economic activity and more restrictions on trade, which is surprising. Liberals have their own sort of restrictions that they want to, so I'm not to, you know, say that it's all on one side, but it's just interesting that the landscape has changed, where there used to be a consensus around this, and now it's very debatable in American politics nowadays. We're going to get into this idea of liberalism. Some might call it neoliberalism. And yeah, I'm going to do some numbers. Don't be too scared. I think it's going to be okay. You're going to be all right. Let's just say hypothetically that there's two countries in the world. We're going to say they're UK and France, and we have two products in the world, let's say, right? Two essential things, food and medicine, okay? So what this chart represents is the amount of product a country can produce for $1. And yes, I'm choosing $1 because it's easy, right? Not because it's realistic. So What we're saying here is that the UK is able to make 5 bushels of food for $1, right? Or 10 units of medicine for $1. France can make 4 units or 4 bushels of food and 3 for $1 and 3 units of medicine for $1. Now, looking at this picture, who's better at it?
UK.
UK. Okay, so yeah, UK is better at it, right? UK can do 5 for $1, France can only do 4 for $1. It can do 10 for $1 in medicine, France can only do 3 for $1 in terms of medicine. Now I'm going to do the math here for you. Save you having to do this math yourself. Just trust me on these numbers. But if they don't trade with each other, let's say that they just focus on their own countries, and we're going to assume that in both countries the demand is 50 units. So each country needs 50 units of food, 50 units of medicine. They're going to make all the stuff that they need here, right? And so for the UK, right, 50 units at 5 for $1, it's going to cost them $10 to make all the food that they need, right? With 50 units, to make 50 units, it's going to be 10 for $1 in medicine. That's going to cost them $5. It's cost them $15 to take care of their food and their medicine needs. For France, it's the same math, right? Only in their case, to make 50 units, 4 for $1 is $12.50, and 3 for $1 is $16.67, so $29.17. All this is done really is just kind of stated the obvious. We already know that the UK is more efficient than France is at it, and these numbers just reflect that difference, that it's going to be more expensive, twice as expensive, for them to take care of their own needs, for France to take care of their own needs, as opposed to the UK. And this is sort of the way that countries traditionally looked at the world when it came to trade. I think I might have mentioned this before, but you know, monarchies were a little like mafia organizations, right? They basically were strong men who had militaries. Give us a percentage of your crop and give us your firstborn to join the army, or we'll just send in the troops and go attack you and kill you. And so in this feudal sort of society, it made more sense to hoard everything you had and then supply it for your own population. You certainly didn't want to take anything that was essential to your survival and trade it with anybody else. And so the idea that you might trade with somebody else was really kind of antithetical to what good security meant. Given this scenario, you might ask, like, how can you ever end up with a situation where you have two countries that are willing to trade with each other? And the answer is math. And so let me explain the logic and then the math that supports it. We introduced this idea of liberal or free trade, okay? Potential world production is greater with unrestricted free trade than it is with restricted trade. That's what this theory argues, right? If you eliminate as many restrictions as possible, then you're going to end up with a lot more production. Second, comparative advantage. It's a key idea behind that. What that means is states, that is countries, should specialize in what they are best at and import other products. Does it make sense for the United States to specialize in bananas? No, I mean, we can't. We're not going to grow bananas here. It's just that's not going to happen. What kinds of things can we specialize in? Cars, right? Airplanes, right? We do all sorts of things. But the point is like we should do the things that we are good at, and then if we're not as good at it, then we should just buy it from other people. Do the numbers bear that out? This is how it works. Keep in mind, we're going to keep demand the same. That is that each country needs 50 units of food and 50 units of medicine. So we're going to have each country specialize in the thing that they are relatively or comparatively better at. That's why we call it comparative advantage, not absolute advantage. That is to say, if you look at the numbers here with the UK, they are 5 for $1 on food and 10 for $1 on medicine. Which one are they better at? They're better at medicine. So comparative advantage suggests that the UK should focus on medicine. That should be their thing. France, which one are they relatively better at compared to themselves? Food, right. So they do food better than they do medicine. So keep in mind, they don't have to have absolute advantage, right? They don't have to be better at even one of the things. They just have to choose the thing that they are the best at for them. So we're going to have the UK specialize and make all the medicine in the system. They're going to keep 50 and then trade 50. And then France is going to focus on the food, and they're going to keep 50 and trade 50. And let's see how these numbers turn out. So Britain, they make all the medicine. 100 units is what they need to make. 10 units for $1, their total cost is $10. France, For them to make 100 units at 4 for $1, it's going to make them it's going to cost them $25. Look at this comparison. I mean, this is crazy. Nothing up my sleeve. It's the magic of the math. The UK was spending $15 to take care of their whole population before. Focus on medicine, now they're just spending 10, and they're getting everything they need, right? France, likewise, they were 29.17 before, now they're down to 25. They're not even as good at the UK in this scenario at either of these things, but by them focusing and specializing on that one thing, they end up saving money too. So this is an idea that was advanced by people like Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations, or David Ricardo in the early part of the 19th century. And it's this economic idea that starts to gain traction. So keep in mind, like this idea that we might just go and trade and treat the world as a global marketplace is not something that really existed prior to the late 18th or the early 19th century. And it took a long time for that idea to catch on. The real growth that started happening wasn't until really the Industrial Revolution, or even really later than that in terms of the massive amount of globalization. In fact, you can actually point to a specific time. So let's talk about that specific time. What's the history behind it? You can trace it back to Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, 1944. Why then? Well, what was happening at this point? This was the end of World War II, and all the Allies got together, except for the Soviet Union. They invited them, and they were like, "Нет, they will not take part in your evil capitalistic bourgeois plans." So they say, "No, we're not coming." But the rest of the world comes together, and they're like, "Okay, we're going to put together a plan to try to liberalize or globalize the world economy based on the economics of people like Adam Smith and David Ricardo." The belief was that protected trade, that is, lots of protectionism, lots of currency manipulation, all this stuff, was the cause of the Great Depression and ultimately World War II. One of the things that was really a trigger, a huge problem for Germany in the early 20th century, was they lost World War I. They were required to pay massive amounts of reparations through the Treaty of Versailles. And as a result of that, any money that was coming out of their economy was getting paid off to the victors of World War I, which created a situation where inflation was so bad in that country that the currency was losing its value so much that it was actually more efficient for them to burn currency in the fireplace than it was to actually burn wood. And so you can understand how somebody like Hitler can come along and say, "By the way, those guys are all screwing us by taking our money. It's the Jews' fault too, so let's kill a bunch of them. Vote me in." The world at the end of World War II, the Allies that is, are saying, "We want no more Hitlers. How can we prevent that from happening again?" And what really created the difference wasn't just the Treaty of Versailles and the reparations, it was the Great Depression that really wiped out the whole world. And so they're looking at the world and they're like going, could this happen again? And how do we prevent this from trying to happen again? Well, what we need to do is create a situation where lots of countries are going to have buy-in in the world economy, and people are going to have the opportunity to get rich. And if they can't do that, then you're going to continue to have problems in terms of global security. So they're looking at this not from an economic perspective, but from a security perspective. That this is going to be the key to creating a lasting peace in the world and preventing a possible World War III. Keep in mind, there's lots of things that came out of this time period, right? We talk about NATO, for example, which is a strategic military alliance between the United States and several of its European allies, the Canadians as well, in order to try to keep, Europe peaceful. Let's combine our forces militarily. But it's the economic security that they believed would try to prevent major problems from happening. And that was the idea that, if we have more globalization, we might have more peace. These are some of the things that came out of Bretton Woods that are really important in terms of understanding how the international trade system and how international business happens. One of the first things that came out of this was called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT. Thought being that one of the things that led to the Great Depression was a lot of protectionism, a lot of tariffs, a lot of trying to keep certain stuff coming across borders and trying to make money by running tariffs through the roof. And so economists generally concluded that was the case. So what GATT tried to do then was reduce tariffs across the board between countries. This was a free trade regime. That is, the idea was to try to create free trade between lots of countries, and it eventually became known as the World Trade Organization in 1995. Its purpose: to reduce tariffs, eliminate protectionism, end trade wars. And the idea is to set acceptable tariff levels based on the relative wealth of the state and to protect industries within certain states. What do we mean by that? What that means is that rich countries are not allowed to have higher tariffs. Poorer countries are allowed to have higher tariffs, right? The reason for that is that the belief is that each individual country should be allowed or able to develop their own industry and have it not being taken advantage of by multinational corporations that are way more powerful than they are. Let me give you an example. Let's say that there's a cola company in India. It's a little startup and it's doing really, really well, okay? Now, if you're Coca-Cola and you're looking at this thing that's happening in India, like a little cola company's going viral, it's doing okay, what do you think you ought to do about that situation? Okay, you could buy it, that's number one. Okay, so you can undercut them, you can put them out of business. I mean, there's all sorts of things that you could do that are really predatory. The people who at Bretton Woods knew that big business was going to do that, right? So maybe there is a role for some forms of protectionism, for some level of tariffs, for the purpose, for at least some countries at certain times, to protect specific industries. Like some of that stuff maybe should be allowable, because what happens if you've got a country and they have no vested interest in their own economy, right? They can't control their own businesses and everything comes from elsewhere. They would argue that's not a tenable position for a country to be stable. So that's the idea, is to try to create situations where there's an incentive for the smaller countries in the world to take part in this system. Now, the other thing that's going to happen is that because it's more open, that does mean that international businesses are going to invest in some of those places, right? They're probably going to take advantage of cheaper land, cheaper labor, and all that stuff. And there's problems with that too, right? But there's also opportunities with that. So creating an opportunity for major corporations to go into places and invest, but not completely exploit, was kind of the idea behind all of this. Before 1993 alone, reduced tariffs between developed countries went from an average of 40% to an average of 5%. So a huge, huge difference. 9 out of 10 disputes between developing states were settled and without armed or public confrontation, leading to a 20-fold increase in trade. The WTO is an international organization. Their ability to enforce anything is subject to the ability of its members to enforce that. And so if the most powerful country in the world just says, hey, we're not doing this anymore, nobody's going to be able to tell them, no, you can't do that. Our tariffs now are higher than they have been since the 1920s. And if you want to understand why Donald Trump and some of his allies are upset with the World Trade Organization and say that it's not fair, is because in a way he's right, in that like by setting different tariff amounts and not having them be the same for everybody, the United States is paying or not allowed to put tariffs above a certain level, and poorer countries are allowed to do that. It is not equal, but it is equitable. Maybe it's okay that it's not equal. And what one would ultimately argue is that the benefits from being part of this system to both the United States and multinational corporations in the United States probably far outweigh the tariffs that we really technically aren't allowed to pay. So another thing that was established at Bretton Woods was the World Bank. And that offers long-term loans or credits that operate at interest rates determined by the market and offers technical help to developing countries to avoid default. The allies at the time were looking for ways for developing countries and startup businesses inside those countries to have access to credit. That is to say, if you're a poor country and you're looking to try to develop businesses, prior World War II, it was really, really hard to get capital, right? You couldn't get loans. Like if they just go to a regular bank and maybe, it's some poor country or something like that, maybe they're not going to get that kind of credit. But the World Bank allows them to have access to things so that they can work on further development. Sometimes you need money to make money, and this is a source of money for developing countries. Another thing that came out of the Bretton Woods was the fixed currency system. Countries used to control their currencies very tightly. And by controlling their currency, like if they could raise the value of their currency, they could buy more stuff. If they could lower the value of their currency, they could sell more stuff. And that led to a crazy imbalance in the global economy. And the United States and its allies said, we probably better put an end to that. Maybe what we need to do is connect everybody's currency together. And the idea was that they were going to take all of the currencies in the world and tie them to the US dollar. So as if the value of the US dollar goes up, then all of these other countries' values would go up because everybody's would be fixed at a certain level. And then the US backed that dollar with its gold. It was fixed at $35 an ounce. And the reason they did this was to try to prevent currency manipulation, which is another thing that they believed was one of the economic causes of the Great Depression and then ultimately World War II. Obviously that did not last, but that would be a story for later on. So the last thing I want to talk about that came out of Bretton Woods is the International Monetary Fund. Its original purpose was to foster orderly foreign exchange arrangements, convertible currencies, and to help states with balance of payment issues. Eventually it became known as a lender of last resort for developing states. So if countries ended up with currency crisis or they're going to default on their debts and so on, then the IMF would lend them money in times of emergency. So again, trying to keep those countries from falling so far down that they would become politically unstable, leading to global insecurity. Or, since the financial crisis, maybe to some more developed countries. Again, that's a story for a little bit later. But suffice it to say is that we had this fixed system, and the IMF was set to try to regulate that by pumping money into certain economies in order to try to prevent there from being a pressure from these different countries all being fixed together. And this stuff costs money. Who do you think bankrolls all this stuff?
United States.
United States, okay? U.S. bankrolls this stuff. And of course, lots of other countries do as well. You know, some of our other allies. Now, of course, it took them a while to get their economies up and going after World War II. But really, you're talking about the so-called free countries of the world, the richest countries of the world, right? Those that are democracies. So we're putting money into it, but we're getting a lot out of it. Lots of countries start getting together and saying, hey, are there special agreements that we can put together in order to even make our free trade even better? And maybe make our ties even stronger. And the EU is probably the best example of that happening. So it started as a free trade organization in 1952 in which 6 countries decided that they were going to freely trade coal and steel. Okay, European Coal and Steel Community. Why coal and steel? Any ideas why? And by the way, this is a really big deal, free trade in coal and steel. Why would it be a big deal? I'm just going to say it. Strategic materials. You need steel to build what? Stuff you kill people with.
Yep.
Bombs, bullets, tanks, planes. How do you fuel them? With coal, right? So they are agreeing to free trade materials that they would otherwise hoard to shoot at each other. And these are countries that traditionally, for like the previous 400 years or more, probably more, have been at war with each other almost constantly. Nobody can trust each other in Europe. Somebody has this harebrained idea of getting together and trading strategic materials, and it actually sticks. So today, it's almost a super state. It's got its own common currency, common political policy, laws that govern all member states, and conditions for joining. And it's growing too. You know, more countries have wanted to join the Eurozone. It's only Britain that sort of wanted to Brexit out, and we'll talk about that another day. Why would people want to get into that? Why would you want a piece of the Eurozone? It embraces all aspects of free trade. No tariffs, free flow of labor, and a single currency. Okay? So what that means is that if you set up shop in France, that means you can sell to Germany, just like Kansas selling to Missouri, right? Just like we don't have tariffs between Kansas and Missouri, we don't have tariffs between France and Germany. That means they're going to sell a whole lot more stuff on both sides. They're going to make a whole lot more money. Free flow of labor. That means like if I'm a German and the unemployment rate is high there, but there's jobs over in France, I just go over to France and get a job. Just like if there aren't as many jobs here in Kansas, I can go over to the Missouri side and find myself a job over there. In a single currency. If any of you have traveled overseas, and I know some of you have, you usually have to take your US dollars and convert it to something else. And it costs money to do that. There's a transaction cost. Like, you don't get a perfect exchange, right? The money changers get their cut. And that's true with any kind of international exchange. If I'm selling something to another country and it's a different currency, then there's going to be some money lost in that transaction. But if everybody's got the same currency, there's no transaction costs. It's like, I just take the same money that I use in France, and I go over to Germany, and I lay it down on the counter, and they take it just the same. Citizens have EU passports. They can cross national borders without guards, just like truckers can move between Kansas and Missouri without checkpoint. And you see why it might be advantageous if you're a business and you get into the EU. So let's say, I have a business that I'm running here in the United States. If I just export my stuff, then I'm still subject to whatever tariffs there may be between these two countries. It might be advantageous for me to say, okay, well, I'm going to continue to operate here in the United States, but instead of exporting, maybe I want to open a business over there in France or Germany or something like that, and then I don't have so far to ship, right? And I'm only dealing in one currency in that country. I don't have to do that currency transaction, right? If I'm in one of the countries, I can sell to all of them, just like in the United States. So that's an advantage to me as a business. So we just finished talking about a rather large case study, the EU, as an example of the extension of free trade and how liberalism manifests itself in real life and has advantages for businesses. I want to just briefly talk about a couple of other case studies before we close the book on liberalism. One is to talk about NAFTA, or what is now known as USMCA. So the idea behind this agreement was to foster trade between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. So dropping tariffs on a whole lot of products, making it a lot easier for those products to move across borders. It did involve some elements of labor. The idea behind it was that if Mexico got access to American markets and was able to sell its stuff more freely there, then that means that there were better job opportunities in Mexico and better opportunities for them there instead of having to necessarily go across the border. Now, obviously it didn't work perfectly like that, but one of the arguments behind free trade is that labor, the more mobile you make labor, the easier it is for the right people to get to the right job, which makes your economy a whole lot more efficient. And it means that, again, on balance, more people make more money. That's a big difference between USMCA and the EU. The EU has a free flow of labor. The United States, well, in the USMCA, we build walls in order to try to keep Mexicans from illegally coming across the border. But it massively benefits the economic operation of the EU, but it also causes a few issues and challenges, which we'll talk about in a future video. The other thing that's really different is that the EU does have a common currency, or at least one that's used by a lot of its members, and the United States, Canada, and Mexico do not. Would the USMCA benefit from a common currency? Maybe, but we definitely don't have the political will or ability to pull that off at the moment. So here's a case study that we don't often talk about. We don't use this in the same language as free trade zones, but I do think it's an excellent example. This is a free trade zone where you have no tariffs, you have free flow of labor, and you have a common currency. And guess what that is? That is the United States. Back in 1789, with the formation of the Constitution, the Commerce Clause enabled a lot of this stuff to happen. So if you recall your history, the United States wasn't always ruled by a constitution. There were the Articles of Confederation. And under that form of government, there was a lot of conflict between states. States were putting tariffs against each other. There were currency problems. There are all sorts of issues, labor problems. And so what the Constitution did was allowed us to not only have a political union, but also an economic union, with the federal government essentially acting as the supreme power in this case. And so we went from a situation where things were sort of chaotic to a situation where people could get jobs across states, and that was now an easy thing. to where we're going to have one currency. States are not going to be allowed to put tariffs on each other anymore. And so I know we kind of take that for granted today, but back in the day, each one of these states considered themselves sort of like their own countries. That's the reason why they were into a confederacy. The term state actually is a legal term for a country. And so this idea that we would have a United States that isn't a loose confederation, but actually a federal form of government, was a huge leap of faith for them. But it also took us a long time to get to the point where we could get comfortable with all of this stuff. It's just important to remember that the United States is sort of the ultimate experiment in liberalism. And for a very, very long time, it's been an extremely successful one. What does free trade mean for the rest of the world? Specialization, that is, focusing on those things that you're good at, has a tendency to lead to wealth. If these countries figure out what they're good at and they focus on it, and they are able to trade it, then they can actually make money. And the amount of global wealth has just exploded since we've had this arrangement. And the United States has disproportionately benefited from it in terms of our total growth and our total GDP. It's not just that, that we're trading, it's the fact that we have now access to more markets than we ever have. And that's what happens when you try to eliminate as many of those restrictions as possible, is you have a tendency to make more money. So inside different countries, that has had a measured effect, particularly in the developing world. Prosperity means that people have vested interests in maintaining it. I get to keep my cola company, and that means that I'm going to work hard in order to try to continue to make that happen. Maybe there will be other cola companies that will rise up in competition to me, and maybe we're not going to get crushed by Coke, or we'll just be one of another Coke, another cola brand, and Coke can compete in that space as well, right? But that gives me, a business owner, the opportunity to have a vested stake in it. This also drives individuals to crave more information in order to make their system work, right? They want to know more about business. They want to know more about their government. They want to know more about what it takes in order to be successful. And that has a tendency to move these countries toward relatively freer societies. How am I going to get accurate information? Well, you need a free press in order to make that happen. How can I get policies through that are going to benefit my business? Well, if I had a democracy, then maybe I could vote for those guys in there to bring in policies that might be favorable to our business. Now, I will pause for a second and say that democracy is not the only way to try to create profitable businesses. I mean, there's other models too we can talk about on another day. But there's certainly, the argument goes that there's certainly pressure toward a more free society if you have businesses and economics that are moving in a more positive direction for developing countries. You have an increased demand for more involvement in government. Higher levels of trade, some would argue, may make war less likely. And I like to use Japan as an example for this. You remember Japan bombed Pearl Harbor to start off the United States involvement in World War II. We ended the war by bombing Japan twice with nuclear weapons, right? Can you imagine a situation today where the United States might bomb Japan? I have a hard time imagining that, because for one thing, I mean, we've sort of worked out an alliance with them, and we've got a good relationship, and so by having a long-standing, respectful relationship there, that helps. But part of it is, a lot of it's based on trade. It's based on that interaction. What would happen? What would happen to the financial markets? What would happen to your investments if you bombed Japan, right? We'll talk more about interdependence later, but this is one of the ideas of interdependence. That is that when countries trade with each other and they have these financial flows and they have all of these different, technological communication connections with each other, it becomes harder and harder for them to hurt each other. It's more likely that you're going to end up with fights between countries that are disconnected than ones that are tightly connected. What are the implications for managers? First, location implications. We need to know what the best places are to go in the world. And some of that we learned through Porter's Diamond and some of the other risk factors that we talked about last week. Second, first mover implications. Sometimes you can go to a market that isn't quite as saturated, doesn't quite expect that investment, and may be an advantage for you. And also, then there's policy implications. Firms should work to encourage governmental policies that support free trade. They want policies that have a favorable impact on each component of that diamond. An interesting case study here. IBM and Apple opposed 1990s tariffs on LCD screens from Japan. That is, like, two American companies said, no, we don't want tariffs against our competitor. Why? Because they argued that their laptops would be too expensive and that Japan was the cheapest source. So trade barriers don't inherently benefit American companies and disadvantage foreign companies. But we are a very interrelated sort of system when we're globalized. You know, if you think, like, one thing, like last time Trump was president, there were tariffs put on, I think, machine parts from China was one of the things, right? There were people, small business people, who needed certain machine parts that were coming out of China, and they were getting priced out of the market. And a lot of these businesses had to go out of business because they couldn't access those things. So American businesses assembled in America, most of the parts are coming from America, but I need some of the stuff from China, and now that's going to cause the price of my stuff to go up, and nobody's going to want to buy it anymore. And so, you know, that's the problem with a lot of these protectionist sorts of instruments. If you're not very careful about how you apply those things, then you end up maybe helping some American businesses, but really hurting quite a few others. The more you know about how the world operates, the better decisions you're going to make if you're a business leader. And so some of this stuff is, you know, a little bit like economics. It's a little bit up here, but it's also, I think, really important stuff if you're the one making those decisions. What did we learn today? First, we learned about liberalism, a major theory of international political economy and a key to understanding business in today's global environment. It assumes that people are interested in profits and making money, and particularly businesses and governments benefit from that. It assumes that specialization is a good thing, that businesses and governments benefit when they focus on those things they're good at and then import or otherwise acquire things that they normally don't do as well at. This philosophy has changed the nature of the international system. There are now international organizations bent toward liberalism with an eye toward improving global security. There are free trade agreements which make it much easier for countries to trade with each other and make it more efficient for business to operate in those places. And this process has seemed to lead to the remaking of security and perhaps a more democratic and a more peaceful world. It's worth mentioning that all of the participants in globalization have benefited in one way or another, but probably none more than the United States and its wealthy allies and associates. Finally, liberalism has driven globalization, and this has created opportunities for businesses to move their products to places where people want to buy them, and also to take advantage of some of the lowest operational prices throughout the globe, and to be able to locate themselves in those places where they can maintain the highest level of profit. Next time, we'll look at a completely different perspective, looking at a lot of the same information. But until then, for Beyond Profit, Global Perspective, this is Mark Harvey. Hope you learned a lot, and I'll see you next time. The same thing is true in terms of France. Are you okay?
Yeah.
Are you?
No, there's just something moving out there.
Some creepy crawly thing out there is going to come and get us.
It's like a huge bird just like following you, Dr. Harvey.
It's a raven. It's a bad omen.
I didn't mean to distract you.
Its original purpose. What's that noise? Sorry. I want to come back here, Lee. All over again.